Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
They will say that I have shed innocent blood. What's blood for, if not for shedding?
Who or what was that guy? Submitted by LEQ. The first thing I remember about this night I'm going to tell you is how beautiful the moon looked on the snow. It was January of 2019, and I had gone cross-country skiing after dinner because the weather was unusually clear and calm for that time of year. I lived in rural upstate New York, where there are plenty of groomed trails that wound through woods, fields, and stretches of state land, and I'd skied them often enough that I knew the route I was taking almost by heart. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I was alone, which wasn't unusual for me. I actually preferred skiing at night when the conditions were right. There's something peaceful about being out there while the rest of the world seems to have disappeared, and there's nothing but the soft scrape of your skis against the snow and the occasional creak of a tree in the cold. That night, the moon was bright enough that I didn't need much more than my headlamp, and I kept it pointed down toward the trail rather than straight ahead because the moonlight did an incredible job illuminating everything around me. The trail itself was beautifully groomed with two narrow tracks pressed into the snow for cross-country skis and a wider packed section beside them for snowshoers and people walking. I'd been skiing for maybe 40 minutes when I entered a heavily wooded section where the trees crowded close together and the moonlight became little more than silver patches between the trees. I wasn't nervous, but I remember feeling particularly aware of how isolated I was. There wasn't a house in sight, no road noise, and no other lights anywhere around me. Eventually, the woods opened up and I emerged into a large clearing, and I slowed down almost automatically because the view was incredible. The moon was hanging low over the opposite tree line and perfectly round, and the snow covering the clearing reflected so much light that the entire landscape looked blue and silver as it only can in the winter. I stopped skiing and stood there for a minute with my poles planted in the snow, just taking it all in. And that's when I noticed someone else. At first, I just thought it was someone snowshoeing along the edge of the trail about 100 yards ahead of me. Well, there was a man there, standing near the packed walking section. He was facing away from me, and because he was positioned by the ski tracks, I again assumed he was just wearing snowshoes. It didn't strike me as particularly strange to see someone else out there. I actually was kind of relieved because even though I enjoy being alone, seeing another person out there made the place feel less remote. So I started skiing toward him, and as I got closer, I noticed something that immediately seemed odd. He wasn't wearing snowshoes, and he was standing directly in the snow beside it, almost as if he had simply walked there. I didn't see any obvious footprints behind him, and although I was still far enough away, I couldn't be certain, though. He was wearing a dark winter coat and dark pants and some kind of knit hat, but nothing about him stood out enough for me to remember his exact appearance later when I tried to remember. He just looked like an ordinary, middle-aged man who had no business being out there at that hour without proper equipment. When I got within maybe 30 feet of him, I called out, "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He turned toward me immediately and raised one hand in a friendly wave. I stopped and smiled because I didn't want to simply ski past someone who was standing alone in the middle of nowhere. He had a pleasant expression on his face, but there was something about the way he looked at me that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't exactly threatening, it was more like he'd been expecting me. We exchanged a few words about the weather, and I asked if he'd been out skiing or snowshoeing. He gave me a little smile and said he was just enjoying the night. When I asked where he'd come from, he gestured vaguely toward the woods behind him and said he'd been around. That answer made me laugh a little because it was so strange. But he didn't laugh along with me. He just looked across the clearing towards the moon and said, "It's good to enjoy things while they're still easy." I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say, and I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged. You know, People think things are always going to stay the way they are, but they don't. I figured he was probably talking about life in general, so I didn't think much of it. But then he started talking about how people were going to become afraid of one another. He said there would be a time soon when people would hesitate before getting close to strangers, when something as simple as sitting beside someone would suddenly feel dangerous. He said people would start paying attention to who had been around whom, where they'd been, and whether they'd been exposed to something. Honestly, at that point, I started to get really uncomfortable. But I did ask him, exposed to what? He looked at me for a moment before answering. Something that spreads. He said it wouldn't necessarily look serious at first, and that some people wouldn't even know that they had it. He said other people would get very sick, and that hospitals would fill up. He mentioned people wearing things over their faces when they went into stores and businesses, and he said there would be periods when people were told they couldn't gather together at all. He went on about schools closing, businesses shutting down, and people staying inside their homes because they were afraid of what might happen if they went out. I laughed a little bit about that because the whole thing sounded ridiculous. Honestly, it sounded like a zombie apocalypse or something like that. And that was what made it almost stranger. He was describing something mundane and terrifying at the same time, as if ordinary life would be switched off for a while. I remember saying back to him that it sounded pretty extreme, and he looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "It will be." He told me people would start fighting about what was happening. He said some would insist it wasn't as bad as other people said, and others would be terrified. He said families were going to be arguing, and friends would stop speaking to one another, and people who had always trusted one another would suddenly become suspicious. The weirdest part was that he didn't say any of it with excitement or fear. He just talked about it like someone describing a trip they'd already taken. Humoring him, I said, "Yeah, so when's this supposed to happen?" And he looked at me dead in the eyes again and said, "Not too far away." That finally made me uncomfortable enough that I wanted to leave, and I told him I hoped he was wrong, and he just nodded. Well, maybe we should just both enjoy this evening." I just nodded because I didn't know what else to say, so I gave him a little wave and pushed off with my poles and started skiing towards the other side of the clearing. I'd gone maybe 20 feet when something suddenly bothered me so badly that I stopped, and I turned around. It was the cold. I'd been standing there talking to that guy for several minutes, and I had never once seen his breath. It was January in upstate New York, at night, well below freezing, and every time I exhaled, a little cloud of white vapor appeared in front of my face. I could see it clearly in the moonlight, and I'd been watching it without thinking about it while we talked, but I had never seen his. I just stood there staring at the spot where he'd been. Yeah, he'd been. He was suddenly gone. At first I thought maybe he just walked back into the woods, but I couldn't see him anywhere, so I called out, "Hey!" I got nothing. I was pretty creeped out, but I became curious about where he'd gone. So I turned around and skied back toward the place where we'd been standing. And I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe he just moved farther into the woods faster than I thought. Maybe I just simply failed to notice him leave because I'd been staring down at my skis. But when I reached the spot where he'd been standing, I got the shock of my life. There were no footprints. I looked around carefully. The snow was pristine except for my own ski tracks. There wasn't a single boot print beside the trail. So I skied slowly along the edge of the clearing, looking for anything that told me that he'd walked somewhere. But I didn't find a thing. I followed the entire edge back toward the wooded section where I'd first entered the clearing, and there wasn't a footprint anywhere. I even skied back over the route I'd taken after seeing him, looking for tracks I might have missed, but there were none. And that's when the fear finally hit me. I turned around and headed back through the woods I'd come through toward my truck. I did it as quickly as I could without falling. I wasn't admiring the moon anymore or the landscape. I didn't care one bit about how beautiful the night was or had been. I got to my truck and finally back to my apartment. I never told anyone about this except my boyfriend. I didn't post about it online, I didn't tell any other friends, and I certainly didn't mention it to my family. I knew how it sounded, and I wasn't interested in being the person who claimed to have met some mysterious prophet in the woods. My boyfriend was the only person I trusted enough to tell because I just needed to tell someone else. Kind of like making sure I knew it had happened. A year later, everything changed. We'd heard reports coming in since December about a new illness spreading, but I gotta be honest, I didn't think about much of it at first. But then the numbers increased. Then the businesses began closing and schools shut down. People started talking about staying home, and the hospitals were overwhelmed. People began wearing masks and avoiding strangers, and yeah, just like he said, arguing about what was happening, and everyone keeping track of who they'd been around. One night, my boyfriend and I were sitting together watching the news in March when something was said about people being asked to avoid gatherings and stay home. We looked at each other, and neither of us said anything for several seconds. We didn't have to. We both remembered the man I met in that clearing skiing that winter night. I still think about that man, or whatever he was. I've tried to explain the encounter to myself in every possible way. Maybe I misunderstood him, and maybe he'd simply been talking about some other event. Maybe somehow I overlooked his tracks. Maybe there was an entirely ordinary explanation for why I couldn't see his breath. But there is one thing I can't explain. I know what my breath looked like that night. I know how cold it was, and I know that while I stood there talking to that guy in the moonlit clearing, I watched white clouds come from my own mouth again and again, and not once did I see one come from his. And also, the footprints, or lack thereof. And I still don't know whether the most frightening part of the encounter was that the guy somehow knew what was coming, or that he seemed completely unsurprised by it. Sometimes when I remember the way he looked at me before saying, "We should just be enjoying this evening," I wonder if he was simply telling me to enjoy one of the last normal nights I was going to have for a long, long time. I guess the warmth of this summer has finally gotten me around to sharing the story with you, Uncle Josh. But that's what happened, every word of it true. Be well. The quiet ones are the worst. Submitted by The Brick Walt. Getting ready to head out for college was supposed to be the only thing on my mind this whole summer. But instead, everything so far has turned into a total nightmare, and I still get freaked out thinking about it even though this happened back in June. That's when it started. At my girlfriend Kristen's high school graduation party, which was just a regular backyard party with warm soda and everybody saying goodbye. But that was the day I met Kristen's cousin Amy, this super quiet girl who lived about a half hour away, who spent the whole afternoon standing by the patio just staring at me without even blinking. At first I figured she was just awkward or trying to figure out how to talk to her cousin's boyfriend. But a few days later, she somehow got my phone number, and things went from weird to straight up scary pretty fast. It started with random texts asking what I was doing this summer. But then she started blowing up my phone every single night with these super graphic, messed up messages about what she wanted to do to me. She kept saying all these things about how she knew Kristen was too nice or innocent to ever do stuff like that for me, which made me feel sick to my stomach. I love Kristen. So I immediately showed her the whole text thread. She was pissed and called Amy right away to call her out. But Amy just acted completely cold and denied the whole thing, saying someone must have hacked her phone to get her in trouble. And even though we wanted to believe she was just embarrassed and would stop, she actually started showing up in real life. I worked the late shift at the McDonald's in my town, 3 nights a week. Around the middle of July, I noticed a dark car sitting at the very edge of our parking lot, right when we shut the lights off at midnight. Every time I walked to my car after work, I could see Amy sitting in the driver's seat, just staring at me through the windshield with that same blank expression that she had on at the party. But the second I turned my key in my car and started pulling out, her car would just vanish into the dark before I could even get out of the lot, leaving me completely freaked out all the way home. I mean, was she following me or what? I had no idea. But the absolute worst part happened Friday night just last week, after my parents were away on a weekend camping trip. I was home by myself in the house. Yeah, only child. I got home around 1 in the morning, totally dead tired after an 8-hour shift, and I called Kristen on speaker to hang out on the phone for a little while and talk about what we were going to do on Saturday. I was just walking down the hallway, kicking my shoes off, when I heard the shower suddenly turn on upstairs, and my heart went into my stomach because I knew nobody else was supposed to be there. I told Kristen to hold on, and I slowly walked up the stairs with my heart pounding out of control. When I pushed my bathroom door open, I almost lost my mind. Steam filled the room, and standing right there in my shower under the running water was Amy, completely naked and soaking wet, smiling at me with this empty look while holding up a pair of metal handcuffs. She didn't say anything at first. She just held the handcuffs up against the glass shower door and quietly said she was finally here to have fun with me like she promised. I lost my shit. I backed out, slammed the door shut, and threw my whole weight against it so she couldn't open it while I hung up on Kristen and frantically dialed 911. I stood there leaning as hard as I could against that door for 10 terrifying minutes. I could feel her moving around on the other side, but she never said a word. And finally, I saw the police lights flashing through my bedroom window. The cops came running up the stairs with their flashlights, yelling at me to move out of the way, and that's when they pulled a wet and uncooperative Amy out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel. Right about then, Kristen and her parents pulled up in the driveway freaking out because Kristen knew something was wrong, and they saw the cops leading Amy out to the police car they'd come in. After talking to the police and calling my parents on a 3-way call, which made my parents immediately pack up their tent and drive straight home, Kristen's parents told me there was no way I was staying in that house alone. They invited me to stay at their place. When my parents got back the next morning, the cops found out that Amy had gotten into our house by smashing a little basement window hidden by the laundry room. She didn't say a single word to the police, her parents, or any of the doctors. She just sat there completely quiet, except for one creepy moment where I'm told she looked at the wall and said, "Walt needs me." They put her in a hospital for psychiatric help right away, but I'm not going to lie, I've got another couple weeks home, but it's ruined my summer. It's made me terrified of my own house. I started packing up my car today, and while I'm bummed I know I won't be seeing Kristen every day since we're going to different colleges, honestly, next week can't come too early. I just want to get out of this town and as far away from Amy as possible. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to UncleJoshTrueScaryStories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.